happy Friday, Dr. Richards.
Happy Friday, Dr. Luck. Good one in June here.
It is nice day. Just get the smog just cleared in Philadelphia, so we can actually take a breath outside today.
Yep, it's nice. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
weird. It's like I was thinking this other day, I was walking around and like everyone's wearing a mask outside
yeah,
and then takes it off as soon as they get in. And
it's
it's
total
like feels like the exact opposite in a way, but the same thing as middle, like heart
it's
of COVID.
bizarro COVID. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I noticed
yeah,
the same thing.
yeah. It's a
It's
good way to
crazy.
put it.
But it reminds me too of just because it was so abrupt that it was so bad yesterday morning that like even when it was still bad last night, like I was telling you, we went to the Phillies game, it felt like easy to breathe, even though that the numbers would say like it was still decently unhealthy. It
Yeah.
reminds me of like if you've ever been in altitude where you go if you're going up in altitude you start to feel sluggish and
Hmm.
worse. But even if you're at a high altitude and you just start coming down a little bit, you
Yeah.
feel amazing. And it was
Yeah.
almost like this weird, the contrast of it was
Yeah.
bizarre. So it was, you live and you learn. I never experienced anything like that before.
I know. I feel like I take it for granted, and then it's bad. But
100%, definitely. All right. So today we're going to discuss joint mobility and all things mobility. So I think this is a nice, connection to what we were talking about with longevity based movements. So, we spoke about squatting, we spoke about things that improve grip strength, and spoke about getting up and down from the ground. And those were just basically like broad movement categories that you can use in a very different ways, right? Like you can
mhm.
add speed to them, you can add strength to them, but they're very broad categories, and ultimately you're trying to use them to improve your fitness. When we talk about mobility, like I think of it more as something that, all right, we're looking at those broad movements and we're seeing that there's something that you just can't do well, right? Like, and there's something getting in the way. And now what we have to do is slow things down and we have to become more focused and maybe a little bit more specific at
Mhm.
times. Like we have to understand where specific joints aren't moving well so that we can make those bigger movements better. So it's sort of like the mobility aspect of it to me is really important, but it's almost like the deconstruction of those bigger longevity movements that we've already discussed.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And then I know, kind of looking at mobility that we did a workshop in the past together. Well, you led it, I kind of just hung out. But I know you have your own thought process kind of about what mobility means from a specific standpoint. But I couldn't agree more on what you already were just saying. But yeah, I mean, when you look at mobility, what are the things that go into it for you, and what are the specifics of that?
So I like to think of it as an equation, right? So mobility equals posture plus breath plus direction. And we've already done a podcast on postural control and we've done a podcast on breath control.
Hmm.
But specific to mobility and just as a little bit of a review, like we could think of postural control or the posture that we're trying to really be mindful of throughout any joint mobility process is approximately where's the head relative to the rib cage relative to the pelvis. So an easier way to think about that is can you keep your head in some type of alignment over your shoulders, over your hips? And that can be done vertically. But if you think about you're standing against a wall, can the back of the head, the space between the shoulder blades and the back of the belt all come in contact with a wall? If not, that's fine. But like having that idea of like be as close as possible. And then if you're more horizontal, it might be like you're lying on your back on the ground and you feel those same contact points. And then we would obviously the orientation can change if we're on our side or on the stomach, but ultimately we want to just be mindful of those three keystone areas. And they
Hmm.
tend to be very proximal, part of the axial skeleton. So even if we're moving from the limbs, the arms and legs, we have to really be mindful of those three areas. And then connected to that is breathing, because if we're mindful of our head, our rib cage, and our pelvis, we're also mindful of our airway and the upper airway, lower or respiratory system. So it's sort of like thinking of that posture and breath as this idea of like we want to optimize that because it makes it easier for us to move pressure through our body, right? If our head's a
Mhm.
little bit forward, we can think of it as we're creating like a kinking in that pressure system. If our head's too far back, we're creating a kinking in that pressure system. And then throughout that chain, we can see that in other places. So, if the lumbar spine is too extended, that's making it harder to move pressure. There's an area that's overly compressed, and then there's likely going to be an area that's overly expanded on the opposite side. So that is a real general way to think about it. And posture is not like a static snapshot, but it is a standard that we have to be mindful of, right? And once we are mindful of like having some type of standard for posture, it really, as a clinician, it really opens your eyes up to seeing the body as a whole better, as opposed to looking at it as like, I got to mobilize my shoulder, I'm just going to move the shoulder. Well, if you're mindful of the posture, you can really understand where people are compensating, where like we're trying to move from the shoulder, but you don't have movement from the shoulder. So now it looks like your hand is moving where I want it to, but like your shoulder blade is moving where I don't want it to. Your head's moving forward, your rib cage is moving somewhere else. So if you're always mindful of those proximal areas, I think a lot of times it really actually helps you truly identify where restrictions are in joint mobility. And then it
Mhm.
also could be something you educate your patient or client on, to say like, you have to be careful of this. You're going to think that you're moving more than you're actually able to move. Like if you're truly limited in mobility, you shouldn't be able to move that much, right?
Right.
But what happens is we're not aware of these compensations from our posture, and then it becomes like you're sort of a dog chasing its tail. You never actually are doing the thing you're intending to do.
Yep.
And then the breath control, like specific to mobility, would be, now once we keep that posture where we want it, we're going to hit walls, we're going to hit restrictions. So where we feel like we hit a restriction, we can use the breath to create extra space, is a way to look at it. Because now breath is sort of pressure, moving pressure from the inside out, as opposed to thinking it more superficially like I'm contracting a muscle and moving. Well, I'm contracting a muscle, but it's my diaphragm, but that creates a cascade of pressure inside. So it gives me more space than I otherwise would have when I hit a barrier.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and it's like I think back to FRC and some of their things, and just the idea of like they might cue it a little bit differently, but it's the same thing where they're trying to move distally, but you're trying to ramp up tension throughout what's happening proximally. And um, I know in practice, we might cue that a little bit differently, but it's funny how it's like the lumbar spine being slightly extended versus flex. Like it's not like it's a crazy amount of degrees, but you'd be surprised at like getting into the right position how much more limited you can feel,
Right.
how much more quickly. And like you were saying, well, if you're able to just move through that area freely, then either that's not the area that needs to be addressed, or some tweaks need to be made potentially proximally to actually expose you to the lack of mobility that you're working on.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of connects to the last piece of the equation, is direction.
Yeah.
We actually have to be aware and educate our clients and patients to be aware of what is their intention when it comes to joint mobility, right? Because a lot of times people will have the intention of, if something is tight, I need to stretch it. And this sort of allows for the discussion of what's the difference between stretching and what we're talking about here, which is joint mobility. Like, to me, they're two different things. And a lot of times, like, the terminology gets in the way. Like, like I would call this mobility, but someone else might call it something else, like in the FRC realm, right? They have
Mhm.
their techniques. So it's become sort of a buzz term to say like you're doing FRC, right? Which is
Yeah.
somebody's creation, like continuing education creation, and they're using isometrics to create joint motion. But I would say, like, if you take out any type of specific branding, the most broad term would be mobility. And why that's different than stretching is because you can seek out a stretch pretty easily, right? And not have any idea of the direction of the joint motion that you're trying to change, right? So let's use like what are the most common areas to stretch? Your hamstrings and your quads, right? So if you're stretching your hamstring, you'll feel a stretch pretty quickly, but you might not have any idea of like what direction are you actually, if like you need to get your straight leg raise higher, what is that at the hip? Like what joint motion is that at the hip? What is it at the pelvis? you can compensate like crazy up the chain and still feel a stretch in that hamstring. So you'll feel the stretch, it might feel good. And there's nothing wrong with stretching, but it's just, if you don't understand the direction of motion that you're actually trying to attain or where you're limited, you will not change, but you'll be stretching all the time. And that's something that I know I've experienced as a complaint from clients for years is I stretch all the time. But I don't feel like I'm making any change or I'm making any progress. Well, it's because it's not a stretching game. It's an understanding of the direction that you're trying to move game. And that's there needs to be an education piece to it, as opposed to just a feeling of stretch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was at a CrossFit event this past weekend, and we were going through some quote unquote mobility sessions as cool downs. And like one of the conversations we kept having with people was, we see it all the time, especially in that CrossFit world where like there's a lot of focus on quote unquote mobility, which ends up being a lot of stretching related things and just getting into extreme positions. But there's a lack of actual actively trying to get yourself into certain positions and having an idea for what's happening proximally. And there's obviously exceptions to that, but that's kind of a theme that I've seen in my experience in that realm. And I think mobility is really learning to get into a new range, joint range of motion, and then control and own that range, and kind of touching your limits of what you can control. But I think you were the one who said this before in that workshop. Like mobility should feel like work when you're going through it.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you hit like these barriers, I like we'll use that term a lot, where it's like you're finding your true end range, then that end range is resistance, like a weight is resistance. Right. So and that's where again the direction and understanding of the direction that you're trying to move becomes vitally important, because once you understand that direction and you hit your barrier, then it's a matter of just saying, okay, let me try to contract my muscles more in that direction. Right. And that absolutely feels like work, because you're not going to be able to move that much, but you still can create force in your muscles. And that takes a lot of energy to do. Right. Because oftentimes you're at your most shortened point, or you're trying to stay in a position that's pretty close to your end range, which might feel like a stretch. Like when you get to an end range, that might feel like a stretch, but it might not. Like if your joint is really blocked, then it might just feel like a barrier. Like I know, like a lot of times with ankles, my ankles, like in order to make any change in my ankles over the years, like I had to stop seeking out stretches of my calves, and I had to really just hit a barrier where like my ankle could not dorsiflex anymore. And then I had to try to move further into that position and try to somehow create more force in that direction. Right. So load it, right. Contract, relax. But it was more of absolutely a strength game. And then taking other joints and allowing my body where I could move a little bit better to create a compression that was able to move my body more in that direction. Right. So, and I can't stress that more, is that like understanding direction becomes this idea of joint mobility. And then when we think about like what's the difference between say fitness and rehab style exercises, to me, instead of calling it like functional movement versus non-functional movement, like I just think of it as when we have to start thinking about stuff that needs to be a little bit more isolated, it's a little bit lower intensity from the speed element, from the resistance element, but it's higher focus. So it has to be slowed down, so that the key is that the focus is higher. Right? Because if the focus is higher, then we can be aware of where the body wants to compensate. And we can think of things like the relationship between the joint we're trying to mobilize and our posture more proximally. So it has to be high focus, but it doesn't mean it has to be easy. Right. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I always think of it in the terms of like a global approach versus a local approach.
Right.
A lot of times in fitness, you might be kind of global first and then get local when you need to, versus rehab, especially like if someone's coming in for a specific injury, you're starting local and in a targeted, focused, high effort way, like you were saying. Like it doesn't mean easy, and then gradually expanding towards more of a global approach, or doing it concurrently most of the time as well.
And even if you're taking a broader movement pattern, just the difference between say going like to a heavy back squat, like that's the hard part of that exercise is the weight, right? And trying not to get
Yeah.
knocked around by the weight. But you
Hmm.
could take a squat and assist it. Now you have you've made it easier, so you've lowered the intensity, but now you can up the focus, right? Like you can now focus on what joints don't move well when I squat. So like if I'm trying to get deeper into my squat, where am I hitting barriers? Well, now because I've assisted the squat, I can actually still be in the shape of the squat, and I can work on the joint mobility in a more specific manner just by decreasing the intensity so I can increase the focus. And I think we can do that. We could do that globally, but we always have to know what the direction is in the problem is, because it's the more global it gets, the more things you have to pay attention to from a
Yeah.
compensation standpoint, and that's where it gets tricky. But from our perspective as clinicians, we can use those global shapes with assistance to see, okay, like, oh, there's a bunch of things I could see just by having someone do that, and then we'll be like, all right, what's the best position to maybe lock that one particular joint? If it's an ankle, well, maybe the squat isn't going to be enough for them. I have to put them in another position that really
Hmm.
is more focused on the ankle. But I still like the idea of like funneling from the broader shape
Yeah.
to the more local joint position, and always having this idea of like we're doing this joint motion to go back to the big broad movement
Yeah.
later on. It's not just to stretch your calves. It's not muscle oriented. It's movement oriented.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also like I think there's a motor learning piece to that too, where if
Yes,
you don't go back to the main thing, then it's like the actual likelihood of that intervention having a lasting success is probably diminished compared to putting you right
absolutely.
back into the context you just came from that was problematic. So for you, like when you're looking at direction and um, trying to actually isolate a specific movement in a joint, how do you are there some broad principles for you about how to limit compensations elsewhere?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's using barriers, using constraints, right?
Yeah.
So if we're doing an exercise where the body's more vertical, if you can use a wall, use a wall, use a pillar. So I use walls and pillars all the time. One of my favorite tools is stall bars in the clinic, just because in a stall bar, like if you're not familiar with it, it's basically just a ladder that's a bunch of pull-ups in a pull-up bars and a ladder against the wall. And the value there is that you can have a grip, a hang grip on the bars, but you also have a wall if you want it. So you can do things like put your arms overhead, anchor your grip, but you have a reference for the back of your head, the space between your shoulder blades and the back of the belt on the stall bars as well, right? So
Yeah.
typically if you're hanging on a bar and it's just a single bar, it's sort of like in the middle of a room. You don't have any contact with your posture, your postural references. So I love stall bars, but it's just different ways to have some type of either vertical or horizontal plane to give you those contact, that feedback, that tactile feedback of where's your head at, where's your shoulders at, and where's your hips at.
Hmm.
And then it's making sure that you just don't make the movement too hard too soon. And sometimes that you have to sell that to the client, because
Yeah.
again, they're expecting more movement, more of a feeling of stretch, where you have to educate that what you're going to really try to seek out or find is a feeling of you can't move anymore. Like
Yeah.
you're really locked down, and now what we have to do is be able to either discuss how to direct into your limits, or maybe we load it, right? So a lot of times, like I'll find with
Yeah.
people that are, if it's safe to do so, instead of trying to force a stretch, like you overload someone into their compensation and then you have them come back into it, or you create an anchor where you almost know that you're going to make the movement too hard, but then because they have an anchor, you can start to sort of move them back. I call that in my book, I call it closed chain mobility, where I want to close the chain. I want the feet to be anchored to the ground, or I want the hands to be anchored to a bar, and then you move them into some type of shape. So if like I want to try to stretch my shoulders behind my back into extension, I'm holding onto a bar with my hands behind my back, and then I'm moving my body forward. I'm falling forward. Now I know I'm going to cheat. My head's going to go forward. My chest is going to go forward. I'm going to lose my pelvis, but I have that anchor. So that sort of like keeps me put in my shoulders. And now I could adjust. I could cue people to adjust what's going on at their pelvis, what's going on at at the chest, at the head. And it's sometimes like the fight back to a better posture. It gives you more information than starting someone in a good posture and then having them try to move their arms or legs, because they can't get enough force in the movement of their arms and legs for them to make much sense of it.
Hmm.
So you can kind of go from both directions. Like you lock down the proximal posture and you move the arms and legs, or you lock down the arms and legs and then you try to get the proximal posture where you want it. And I find that that actually works really well early on, because it feels more like a stretch, but it also then feels like a fight, like a strengthening a fight, like almost like a core exercise. So you can even use these buzz terms like, yeah, this is working your core and we're stretching at the same time. And then you're using gravity to create like a little bit of a hang effect. So
Yeah. Yeah. I've found honestly most of the changes I feel like I'll get with people with range of motion, especially like I'm thinking about say trunk rotation
mhm,
overall is like starting to overload some type of, and this is a little bit different, but like getting them into actually a variation of like a loaded movement, whether it's like a Pallof rotation or some type
mhm,
of rotational row, and actually like forcing them to use the muscles associated with rotation start to then unlock, quote unquote, unlock some more mobility and open
mhm,
things up when you take them out of the actual loaded environment.
right.
Um, and I think, it's different, but also similar in terms of like you're leveraging certain areas of the body to either feed or fight against their given compensation. And then there's more force going
Yes,
into it so that there's also more awareness about where your body wants to move and where you're actually trying to move it or vice
absolutely.
versa.
And the key term there is awareness, right? So like that, there's different ways to create awareness of the thing that you're trying to work on. And ultimately that comes back to like we have to be educators as clinicians, but also like if you're just in the general population and trying to get more fit and trying to get more mobile, you have to be willing to learn, not
Yeah.
just seek out like something that's easy enough to do, because the things that are easy are probably not going to be the things that are useful. So you have to be willing to sort of like either work with somebody or just go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. There's a lot of good information out there that's for free now, but like it is a learning process, not a individual intervention ever. So, but that there's
Yeah.
different ways that we can provide that awareness. That's a little bit like it's a better way to teach, instead of right verbally just telling
Right.
somebody something. They feel it because we've given them some type of implement to feel it. Well, now they've learned something quicker and probably it's going to be more ingrained. So I think that ultimately is the process of mobility and all movement is a learning process. And we just have to become better teachers. And then some of these techniques are just better ways to teach.
Hmm. Yeah. Couldn't have said that any better myself.
And the thing that made me think, you just made me think about was when we started working together, like when we first met. I think I did an assessment on your mobility and things like that. And one of the first things that we did, and you're a very athletic guy, but you got your stiffness definitely in your body, which is not unusual for a big, strong, athletic guy. So what did we did a lot of ground sitting work, right?
Hmm.
And with ground sitting, you have this idea of like if you get these postures better, you are going to now not just have mobility that is like we could talk about like the joints individually, but you're just going to have more positions that you rest in. So you'll likely be in those positions more often because
Hmm.
they're more accessible to you, and it'll be harder to lose those positions over time. So I think that ground sitting just as a category becomes like a really, really useful way to think about mobility. And we did a lot of using the wall
Yep.
connected to the ground sitting, just because like when you sit on the ground, if you don't have that your back support against the wall, you're not going to have any reference for what your compensations are. But as soon as we did that, we really got a sense of like obvious limitations, right? And
Yeah.
the same thing for me. So I think like trying to do things like sitting cross-legged on the ground, but put your back against the couch or on a wall,
Hmm.
and just be really aware of like the relationship between how close can your knees get to the ground, and but not losing any of those contact points against the wall. And you'll be surprised like how limited you are, even if you feel like normally you sit decently well cross-legged. Like the change, because you've changed the postural cues, I think the awareness becomes very obvious then. And then what you can do is fill in spaces. right? Because like our goal is to get more contact points with something, contact points with our own anatomy, or contact points with the ground, contact points with the wall. So we're having those contact points give us more stability, right? So if we could sit cross-legged and our legs, the outside of our legs can touch the ground, that's like creating a triangle with our body. Basically, we've created a lot more stability. So then mobility equals stability in a very specific way there. But most people aren't going to get there. So what we can do is fill in the space. But by filling in the space, we allow us something to push into. We allow us now something to create a direction into. And that becomes, I think, one of the most valuable ways to just start working on your mobility. Have a ground sitting routine. So cross-legged is one thing you can do. Long sitting, where you put your back against the wall and just have your legs straight out in front of you, like, and try to get your body at like a 90-degree angle. We would think of that as sort of like, yeah, you'll feel your hamstrings, your posterior chain, but you and I know that that's also looking at, how well does your pelvis and your hips, how well do they internally rotate, right? So like they become nice assessments for us, but they're really, really easy, I think, to get people to just start and to modify, right?
Yeah.
Because they're safe, and you have some type of support, and then the idea of filling in the spaces to me becomes a new way of objectively looking at mobility, right? So you can have language around your cross-legged position where it's like cross-legged against the wall with two cushions under the knees, right? Now it's one cushion under the knees, or it's two pads that equal 3 inches, right? Like you can be pretty objective with how you're changing, these patterns over time. So I just think that those are going to be go-tos for me all the time, and it's connected to using walls and the ground, but making it about positions that you would be able to sit in on the ground, so that you have more options than just sitting in a chair.
Yeah, and I think what's also important about the adding, kind of closing the gaps or filling the spaces is, well, the more reference may allow you to spend more time in that position as well,
Yeah.
which is going to be beneficial. And it's like, if you're straining to just hang out in a position for 10 seconds, then it might actually be too hard off the bat. And maybe that's a good thing to come back to over time and reassess. But you probably want something where you can tolerate some time in that position.
Yeah.
And that'll vary, but based on duration. And I
Yes.
think also, in terms of, on the other side of like filling the spaces gives you something to push into, it also gives you something to relax against potentially.
100%.
And I think that's really important too, especially for people with probably more of like a force training, heavy strength training background. Sometimes learning how to relax
Yeah.
is, like, for me, that was one of the biggest benefits about ground setting, is I'm like, oh, can I actually just, before I even contract in this direction, can I just try to let things go
Yes.
and touch the wall and
Right.
find a comfortable position there? And you talked about different ways to rest, and I
Yeah.
think that directly connects to it.
Yeah, and that's where I think that connects to filling in the spaces too, right? Because if you
Yeah,
have a contact point with your anatomy, even if you have to bring the ground up to meet your anatomy because your mobility is not there yet, you've given your body comfort, right? Like you've given, it's not just hanging out in space. The limbs aren't hanging out in space. That's going to make you feel like there's this push pull that's going to create a lot of guarding around the area. So having a contact point that you push into, it can give you the option to create force into it, but it can also give you the option to relax. And ultimately, that's part of what we're doing with the creating of direction. Like, although it feels like a lot of work to contract our muscles, like in a direction that is at our end range, as soon as we relax after that contraction, it
yeah,
tends to almost confuse the body into relaxing more, right? So there's these
yeah,
PNF neurological principles that contract, relax, reciprocal inhibition, all this stuff is, it's a short-term change to the nervous system, but it these changes allow us to go a little farther than we otherwise would, and they allow us to relax. So we can relax actively or we can relax passively. And again, when it comes back to the breath, all right, so now we've hit a barrier. Instead of trying to contract the actual joint we're working on in the direction, we can just change our breathing and notice how the breath gives us space in one direction, and maybe as we're breathing out and we're letting go, we're deflating. Well, now we get some space, but that also like just takes all the tension out of the body that was guarding and we didn't even know was guarding, right? So all of that fits in. You mentioned duration, and I would say like that would be the fourth variable that could be put into the equation. And maybe next week we'll do a connector episode where we talk a little bit more about pressure therapy, which is just the terminology that I use for things like foam rolling, using massage balls and even the vibration guns and things like that, because I think those things are super useful, but there definitely needs to be another education and a discussion about like how you can get the most out of them and what they really are doing versus what they're not doing. But in that discussion, duration plays a huge role. And I would say like in any mobility, the game of mobility is like the better you get at mobility in any joint, like the longer you'll be able to hang out in that position without a problem. Right. So I think mobility and endurance are like directly linked, right? Because as your mobility gets better, you don't have to work as hard to fight for a position. Now you can always try to get deeper. So whenever you hit your end range and you're trying to go deeper, now it's going to be a harder game. But in just like the functional position discussion, if there's not as much resistance to get into a position, you can spend more time there. But in order to get to that point, you have to spend more time there. Right? So duration is, you have to make it comfortable enough that you can spend more time there. And I think that's key.
Definitely.
So well said. All right. Yeah. So I think that would be a good next week discussion, is to go deep into pressure therapy, talk about that. Because I know that's for both the clinician and for just the client. There's a lot of information out there about it. And I think like in the physical therapy realm, like there's a lot of people that have just like poo-pooed it and like thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because we realized like a lot of the claims were overly, they were just overblown, right? So we realized like, all right, this is not what it is, but there's still value there. And I think there's a good discussion about what the value can be, which is linked to what we were just talking about today.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that'll be a great conversation.
All right, look forward to it.
Me too.
See you next week.
See you then.